But here's the problem. Out of all the Christian kids in the government school system, what's the survival rate? How many of those kids make it, graduate, still feeling like aliens in the world? And how many have been recruited successfully by the world? So welcome to another reaction video. Today we're going to be reacting to some comments made by Jen Wilkin in a recent interaction on the issue of government schools or public schools. So here goes. This is a subject I don't have a lot of opinions about, so wish me luck.
But one of the big benefits that came from having children in the public school system from our perspective was they had an exposure to such a broad array of kinds of people. So that when we had conversations about something that was going on in the culture, or even the hot button issues right now, like sexual orientation, gender identity, all of that, those were not just categories that we talked about, those were people. Those were friends. That was an embodied truth. That was someone who sat next to them in class, or it was a teacher. And so we were able to humanize those conversations, and that was really a gift. Not only that, they were around children from different socioeconomic levels. They were around children from different racial communities. They were
just a note here. It is should be pointed out that private schools have children from different socioeconomic levels and ethnic backgrounds and stuff. What she's talking about here is not unique to public schools.
They were around special needs children. That's one of my favorite things about the public schools is that children with special needs are actually in with the other children. They have a buddy system to help these kids, and they're visible in the lives of these kids every day. So they also had exposure to kids whose home situations were very different than theirs. And one of the things about a public school experience is no one is really pretending.
Notice the quiet assumption that if you're in a private school, everybody's pretending, or most people are pretending. And to say that people's home situations, students' home situations were different. What do you mean different? She likely means that there were students whose home situations were a helicopter crash, divorce and messed up and estrangements and single parent families and that sort of thing. It's not just different. It's not just different. There is there's a scale of value here.
It's all right out there. And so our kids knew very early what it meant to be aliens and strangers. And that was something that we're able to say to them was a feeling to welcome, not a feeling to push away. That the more different you feel from the people around you, assuming that those differences are rooted in a Christian conviction, then the more you can know that you are probably being conformed to the image of Christ.
Let me hasten to jump in at this point to agree with her. And this is an area, and this is going to come out in what she says just following this. I went to government schools from kindergarten through my master's degree when I was in elementary school. My parents were evangelical Christians, doggedly evangelical. And whenever there was a collision or a choice to make between what my parents taught and what the school was teaching me, I always went with my parents. And it looks like the Wilkin family is successfully did something very similar to this. I always felt like an alien in a strange land, and I held on to that. But here's the problem. Out of all the Christian kids in the government school system, what's the survival rate? How many of those kids make it, graduate, still feeling like aliens in the world? And how many have been recruited successfully by the world?
And that means being a soft presence, not being necessarily even a loud presence. I do think one of the misconceptions about Christian parents who send children to public school is that we've sent them there to be missionaries, to be salt and light. And I crack up about that because the kids were actually involved in a Bible study at the school there in high school that was called Salt and Light. And I was like, shoot. Yeah.
Well, that's a good example. It's not a misconception. It's not a misconception if virtually all the parents who have their kids in the public school tell you that the reason they're doing this is so the kids can be salt and light. It's a cliche for a reason. It's a cliche because it's repeated over and over and over. And it's kind of healthy and winsome and good that she's pushing back against that because, as she says in a minute, a second grader is not in a position to be salt and light. That's very, that's very true. But then somebody is evangelizing. If your child is not evangelizing them, is anybody evangelizing your child?
But the reality was we sent them there for an education, and we knew that we would have a role as their parents probably in being salt and light, and we assumed that if they grew into their faith and did in fact, become believers and then mature into that there would be that influence. But we were not trying to send us.
So the problem is, if she says we didn't send them to be salt and light, we sent them there for an education. But all we have to do is compare test scores, the performance, private schools, private education, homeschool, private school, government school, and say if the point is to get an education, then the question should be, where's the best education? If you're after education, where's the best one? Well, she's saying we sent them for an education, but clearly that's not primary. There's something else. There's some sort of experience with the world that she wants her kids to have gone through.
Second grader into a secular space to share the good news. We wanted to train our kids into that so that anywhere they went, that became something that was intuitive. But we were not on mission in that sense in the local school. Yeah, they all graduated from the public school system with an overwhelmingly positive experience and with a world-class education, and they went on to go to a large public university as well after that.
Now, I'm assuming from how she's speaking that they also graduated, all of them, with their Christian faith intact. So if she said they got a world-class education, I'll note again, they could have gotten a better one elsewhere. But if they graduated with a world-class education and with a good experience behind them and their Christian faith intact, then the only thing I would say to the Wilkin family on that score is well done. But I would also say that's not the norm. That's not how it usually goes.
And we look back on it, and I think now the question that I get most frequently is like, but you wouldn't do that now, right? Like knowing what you know now. And my answer would be that yes, I would, because I know what our school district is and isn't teaching.
She ought to name the name of this wonderful government school district that her kids went to, so that all the other parents in the area who are having horror stories brought home can go there. Right. And
what I see happening now around this conversation is a great deal of misinformation and fear-mongering. Some of the things even in our own district that parents will say are being taught, I know are not being taught. And what I think is happening is people read an article about something that happened somewhere else, or they hear a story. There's a lot of hearsay that travels around about what is or isn't going on. And because we live in a time where fear is something that is leveraged at every turn, it takes root, and they end up making a fear-based decision instead of an educated decision. I think there are legitimate things to be concerned about with a public school education, but whether your district is actually the one that is implementing those things or not is something that you should get firsthand information on.
Yeah, agreed. Basically, you want to find out. You don't want to be running down the street with your hair on fire because you read something on the internet. That's true enough. You should verify that the government school where you're reacting to is under the State Board of Education, who said X, Y, and Z. Yeah, but I don't think it's going to be that hard to establish that these are, whether people are reacting fearfully or not, they're not irrational fears. There's something, as she even says, there are concerns, big ones.
Not have heard about from someone else. And I would also just urge not to contribute to fear-mongering and hearsay if you're a parent who's trying to make those decisions. I recently put some information on this perspective up in my stories on Instagram, and I don't spend enough time on Instagram for the algorithm to feed me a lot of attention. And so when I say that I got hundreds of DMs in response to what I put up in support of public schools, that is not normal for me. And almost all of them were from Christian teachers in the public schools who said, I have been vilified and maligned by my Christian community because I teach in the public schools.
Now, first, Christians who love the Lord, who teach in public schools, should not be vilified and maligned. Let's just say that at the top. No Christian ought to vilify or malign other Christians. Given, granted, agreed with 100%. But I've been involved in education for decades. We started Logos School in the early 80s. We started work on it in the late 70s. I've been up to my neck in education issues and around Christians who are private school parents and homeschool parents. And I've never seen anybody vilify public schools teachers. And it's not like they're not around. I've had people who teach in public schools in my church, and they are supported and prayed for and encouraged. So the fact that what I'm guessing here is that she's hearing, she just a moment ago said we should verify that what's being alleged is actually going on. She's getting DMs from people who teach in the government schools who felt vilified and maligned. But is this because they listened to a sermon where the pastor urged private Christian education, and they felt vilified by implication? Are they hypersensitive? Perhaps there's fear-mongering running the other direction also.
And that's not right. I mean, so I think one of the things I would love to have entered into this conversation is that while I cannot tell you to put your children in public school, and certainly never would because there are so many factors that are at play, that it is important for us to understand that our decision regarding this and even our demeanor toward this has an impact on our community. It doesn't just impact our family. The most common phrase I hear thrown out in these conversations is, well, I just need to do what's best for my family.
But when we're talking about what's best, are we talking about 5 points on the SAT, or are we talking about the survival of someone's faith? Are we talking about the child shipwrecking their faith? Are we talking about a junior high girl announcing she wants to be a boy? Yeah, you need to do what's best for your family and not subject your kids to that. But Wilkin has a point. If I've got to do what's best for my family, you're talking about a 15-minute drive to school instead of a 30-minute drive to school. Yeah, okay, fine, good.
I think that's something that as Christians we have to push back on. Philippians tells us each of you should look not just to your own interests, but to the interests of others. And there's no such thing as a decision that's made just for our families. In fact, even having the gift of the decision at all means that you're a person with more choices than some people. And those who don't have a choice of where they will educate their children will be impacted by your presence, your adult parent presence not being in the public schools because you've chosen to go somewhere else. We can look back in not too recent history on this and see the impact of when a large number of Christian parents decide to opt out of the system and how it impacts those who are left behind. And so I do think it's very important for us to understand that while, yes, we do what is best for our families, we don't do so in a vacuum. We understand that what we do for our family always impacts the community around us and that we should look to the welfare of the city in which we live.
But, of course, bad things might happen to those Christian parents who remain in the government school if a large number of other Christian parents pull their kids out. But I think we learned a little bit earlier that we ought not to make decisions based on fear of what might happen. Now, an important thing to note about all of this is, like I mentioned a bit ago, I've been involved in the education battles and the education reform and all of that for decades. And I have taught for a long time that there is no sin in the scriptures called sending your kids to government schools. That's not the sin. The requirement is to bring up your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Your children should receive a Christian education. If you do that by means of homeschool, great. If you do it by means of a private Christian school, great. If you're a dedicated Christian family, let's say the Wilkins, and you read all your kids' textbooks and you counter all the nefarious lies that are contained therein, and you have all the teachers over for dinner, you're interacting, let's say you're active and involved, and you successfully navigate the rapids of the government school system, and your kids love the Lord. They graduate loving the Lord. They go on to live full, healthy Christian lives. I am not going to come in and tell you that that was a sin. The requirement is to bring up your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. The requirement is to have your kids grow up, Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9, to grow up in an environment dominated by the Word of God. And if you're interacting with your kids' secular education at a high intensity level such that your kids receive a Christian education knowing how to reject the lies that they're being fed at school, then frankly, my hat's off to you. I would also point out, somewhat mildly, that you could probably have started 3 Christian schools with half the effort.